So our next presenter is Dr. Joshua Frank Cárdenas. He was born in Anaheim and raised in the Yarborough of Lake Elsinore, California. He has an Irish Studies certificate from the University of College Cork Island and a BA in History and American Indian Studies from UCLA. Please welcome Dr. Joshua Frank Cárdenas, whose presentation is titled Unity, Educational Medicine for California Borderland and Border Town Violence.
Sego, everybody. Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation and the work that was put in over the last couple of years by the organizers, but also by the people here, right? Holding it down in their own communities, continuing with their work. I really appreciate everybody coming together. I just wanted to first acknowledge the people in land here. So Sego, Nyangwa, Agwego in Titinuanonga, Nonkwehonwe Tono, Teotihuacan, Onkwehonwe, Che, and Awaragoa. So I wanted to thank and acknowledge the people. So all the people here, but especially the Onkwehonwe, the original people of this land, the Kizh Tongva people who've allowed me to live here, visit here, work here, love here, and be a guest for my life here. And then also the Payamka Wicham or Luiseño people of Pachinivetwana or Lake Elsinore, where I grew up, have a lifelong home because of their graciousness in letting me stay there unmolested for so long as a young person. I currently live and work out of the University of New Mexico on Tiwa territory, near Isleta Pueblo is where my home is, but I work in University of New Mexico, which is Niafen or Sandia Pueblo territory. So just wanted to acknowledge that I'm a guest worker there as well. So hopefully they don't revoke my my papers too soon. This is a kind of a long story shortened, right? So I'll be focusing on the key connection of unity between Chicano and Indian people in their struggle for higher education in the context of California, a state born out of violence and through violence and is maintained via violence today. So how do people survive in this kind of environment? So first off, I'd like to start with some of the words of one of its progenitors and founders, Jack D. Forbes. He was a lifelong Los Angeles resident of Rappahannock and various other European ancestry, and was also the founder, one of the original founders and dreamers of DQ University, which I'll be talking about today. But he was also an alumni of USC. He graduated in '55 with his BA, in '56 with his master's, and in '59 with his PhD at the age of 25. So to give you a sense of the kind of magnanimous aspect of him, I'll share just a little bit about what he thought about DQ and its founding to give you an idea of the words of the man. So DQU was built in struggle via dreams and actions because Chicanos and Indians perceived, as Forbes notes, that this was founded when a group of Indians and Chicanos broke through 4 centuries of colonialism to found DQU. Or perhaps we should say they were called upon by the great creative power to do what had to be done at this particular point in time. So very prophetic in his words, but how many of us are aware of our past, right? Realize that the footsteps that we project and perform in the future are a continuation, right? So he as a historian, this is his perception, that he is very much just continuing the process of resistance and survival. That didn't work. Okay, I had to represent UCLA. I'm an alumni, not of USC. We have an American Indian alumni of UCLA. I'm the vice president, and I really suggest that USC develops an American Indian alumni of USC to keep your students and people connected, and connected to people like Forbes, who were a student here, which many of the students here currently do not know and are unaware that great work has been done here by Native people in the past when Native people weren't acknowledged on this campus and there was nothing for them, right? It's barely the 21st century that we have a Native American Student Assembly and things like that here. So I applaud that effort on behalf of students, but suggest that more work should be done, such as at UCLA. Just kidding. I had to throw in a little bit of something, spice it up. Now I'm having technical difficulties because of this. Okay. All right, safe. So who is Jack Forbes and what was his great dream is one aspect of this I think people should make a connection to. He was the principal founder of DQ University and its progenitor. He was born January 7th, 1934 in Baja de los Alamitos, near Suangna, which is Cal State Long Beach area. So he was born within the sound of the sea, as he recalls. And he passed away in 2011 in February in Yololandia, which is the name that he gave for the Patwin Plains near Davis, where he lived and taught for the last 40 years as one of the founders of the Native American Studies Department at UC Davis, but also 10 miles away was where DQ University was located. He's one of the most heavily published people I've ever come across. He's kind of like a W.B. Du Bois or one of these just absolutely insane writers. So in my estimation, he has more than 555 published works and 1,000 or more unpublished stuff that I've been accessing and using for many years. He was a founder of the Native American movement in 1961. So this is 7 years before the founding of the American Indian movement in 1968 in the Twin Cities by the Banks and the other character, missing his name. But the Native American movement, or the Movimiento Nativo Americano, it had a Spanish name as well, sought to include all Native people of indigenous ancestry. And this had to do a lot with his experience growing up in and around Los Angeles, being surrounded by indigenous people who were not necessarily recognized as indigenous people. So he took it upon himself to help organize Chicanos and Indians and other people together, African Americans as well, right? As 75% of African Americans prior to the Civil War had Native ancestry. There's a continuation of this experience, and he acknowledged this. He acknowledged that the mixture of indigenous people everywhere, Mexican, African, Native to the Americas, North America, was a good thing, a positive thing. But right, in the racist history of the United States, it's seen as a negative thing, as a backwards process. He also helped found many other organizations, such as the California Indian Education Association, the largest statewide body of Native educators, which has been around since 1967-68. He helped found the California Indian Legal Services, which led to a lot of other legal services organizations, the Rural Assistance League and some other groups, MALDA. He helped found UC Davis Native American Studies, but also Native American Studies programs throughout the country, right? So he was here he was at UCLA helping found the program. He was at Berkeley helping found the program. He was at UC Riverside helping found the program. He went throughout the United States helping found Native Studies programs. And in fact, he wrote a proposal for an American Indian Studies department and degree program in 1960. 1960, 8 years before any of the first programs started to see any light of day, and it was rejected by San Fernando Valley State College, now CSUN, when he was an early assistant professor there, right? So he had ideas and was fomenting ideas and action via the organizations, via his political work, and in the community as much as he possibly could. And this is for Chicano and Native empowerment and survival. Let's see here. Here, I just want to give you a snippet. This is from the 1961 El Rodeo yearbook at USC. This is an image of him off of Santa Barbara Island. He was studying here, right, from 1951 or 1953. He transferred from Glendale College to USC and did all the rest of his bachelor's, master's, and PhD doctoral work here. While he was here, while he was a student in 1956, he was on the show Truth or Consequences, which had Jack Bailey as the MC at the time. And then in December of that year, Bob Barker became the famous MC of that show. And so as part of his application or to be on that show, he was sent off to Santa Barbara Island to survive for 2 months. And when he came back, he had the opportunity to answer 6 questions based on current world events, things that he would have missed while he was gone. And he was able to answer 5 of those questions correct. And he was awarded $9,000 at that time, which is about $96,000 in today's purchasing power. So, and he wasn't a greedy man. This was all based on his knowledge, his ability, his research, his application of knowledge. So you can see, right, it didn't matter where he went or what he was doing, he was gaining and learning and growing. So he says, right, oh, I did study, and this is like reflection of the past. He says, my grades went down Eagle Rock High School chem lab sinks in geometry wastebaskets as I read book after book on my own and cut classes to head downtown. Yellow cars speeding me to vast quarries of oil company maps, timetables for all railroads, and other rich facts needed to define reality, carefully ignored by teachers lost in LA city schools, master plan to make most of us dumb down, right? So he had this perception about California, about Los Angeles, about the world. It was very critical and very apt because of his experience in it, not just reading books, right? Cutting classes, hanging out in jazz venues downtown. This is some archival records from his experience at Truth on Santa Barbara Island. He wrote 2 papers while he was there, each 80 pages. So, you know, you give him a month and he'll write a book. Here's a sample of some of his works. Apache, Navajo, and Spaniard is his dissertation that was published in 59, it was published in 1960, University of Oklahoma Press, and has been in print ever since. There are very few works from 1959 in Native American studies or in the field that have been in print ever since. His most famous work, Columbus and Other Cannibals, is kind of a polemic piece which describes basically the history of the world until today through the lens of imperialism and native survival. So he talks about these ideas together. And then he's got a number of works that are documentary of his work and his travels and his experience. So he documents the struggle for the founding of DQ. It's a very small monograph, out of print, can't find it. He wrote stories and poetry. He did all types of things, kind of a jack of all trades, if you let that one slide. But why, right? But why, right? What's the connection? Well, that's because California, right, was taken over after the invasion of the Republic of Mexico, forced the selling of California and forced the selling of indigenous lands here, which were not ceded by Native peoples and which were not lost in any battles or anything like that, right? So the case of California is truly a unique case, but it's also a very extremely genocidal case because Native peoples here were subjected to the most heinous experience that you could possibly imagine. So they experienced what Howard Adams called, who was a colleague at Davis and elsewhere, the tortured politics of colonization. So one of the stages of colonization or colonialism is assimilation, right? And so boarding schools, day schools, off-reservation, non-reservation schools, religious schools were all implemented before, during, and after the founding of California, right? In order to deal with the mass of indigenous population that were here. You have to remember in 1848, when California became part of the United States, it was estimated by John Bidwell, one of the early European Mexican citizens that came here, along with Johann Sutter and some other folks, that there were less than 100 white people in California at the time of the war with Mexico. So it was completely dominated, 99+% by Native people. And then the California or Mexican population was largely indigenous rooted as well and had indigenous ancestry. So we are talking about an absolute like percentage of a percentage that came here. And in order to take over this land, they had to commit extreme genocide. In California, there were at least 6 on-reservation and 2 off-reservation boarding schools. Sherman Indian High School here in Riverside, California, not too far away, still exists and is Sherman Indian High School. So this legacy still persists, the experience still persists, the connections still persist for Native people. There were 30 day schools and dozens of other religious and other schools. California was also one of the places where Native people were first allowed to enter public schools. So we have that experience came at a very early time in California. So looking at the founder and author of the term adolescence, Stanley Hall, the educational psychologist, he came up with this conclusion, and this conclusion came up with while attending the Friends of the Indian Lake Mohawk conferences in upstate New York. He says, the world goes to school. This has become the method of colonization and completes the work of conquest by armies, right? So this fits apropos into the stages and levels of colonialism and imperialism, right? That education is one of these arenas. Native people were characterized as savages in need of civilization, conversion, via subordination and a special education. African Americans and Chicanos too were given no or little education or a special education, such as in California, being ostracized to the Mexican room, right? This is a common experience for people here. So the real issue, right, is that imperialism and colonialism work off of dividing the people up so that they can be easily conquered, easily manipulated, easily controlled. And so he found that this was the case of California, this was the case of the United States. So he says that the colonial system, number one, forced mixed bloods to identify as tributary Indians, right? So that they could be taxed, so that they would live on and off reservation, they would be useful. It also forced visibly non-white persons to join a free colored caste system if they wished to live away outside of the military reservation rule system. And then number three, it accentuated notions of white supremacy and made people very much caste conscious, right? So a racial caste system was implemented in the United States. And he's very much aware of this as an educational historian. And he says that's the secret of colonialism, right? Divide the conquered masses into rival groups with a small sector, light-skinned groups, Latinos, mestizos, like mulattoes, being used to kill, lash, and control their brethren. So if this is the policy, right, if this is the practice, then we must take the opposite approach. We must unite, we must organize, we must work together, we must find ways to heal rather than hurt each other, because this is going to be used against us. All of these things will be used against us, and these aren't of our making. These are foreign concepts, foreign ideas that people have adopted and adapted, right? So in 1852, in a government report, Captain Leah explained that destiny had awarded California for the Americans to develop, and that if Indians interfered with progress, they should be pushed aside, right? So is this still the case? Is this still the situation? Yes. And so Forbes recognized that Native people were uneducated, miseducated, out of full participation. The lack of the ratification of 18 treaties in California is one example, as well as the mass genocide in a matter of 20 years. Population went from 150 to 15,000 people or so. So we have a massive undoing that needs to happen. So what is DQU? Why study it? For me, it's this idea of unity is the most important one, right? So this was an opportunity surrounding for the people to identify that one of the key arenas of their struggle needed to be in education, right? So Forbes found that this was a way to perform a peaceful revolution, right? This is a way for people to unite, organize, plan, and act out their desires to not only be free peoples, but also to perform education in the way they saw fit. So I went there to DQU in 2005 to try to attend, but it was already falling apart. People were protesting each other. I could not attend. So it only survived 35, 40 years. And doesn't this sound a lot like many other Native and other mixed Indian projects, right? Where we work so hard, but yet we're fighting against an uphill battle most of the time against people who do not want us to survive, do not want us to prevail. So this is an example of one of the first publications. It's in English and in Spanish. It was published completely by students. So it was really students, despite this being Forbes's vision, and besides Forbes having a lot of influence and a lot of impact, it was really students who worked through the struggle of becoming united as a group, of finding their indigeneity every day on campus, of working the angles, right? So for Forbes's perspective, right, the issue was in US society in California was that white people hadn't assimilated into the indigenous and Mexican cultures of the Southwest, right? So his perception was that Native people and Chicano people needed to revitalize traditional knowledge, language, culture, identity, peoplehood, personhood, but at the same time, they also had to deal with a population of people that were completely unassimilated to the environment, to the peoples, to the traditions, and instead we're trying to force down foreign institutions and systems upon them. So Forbes's conception of the struggle is one definitely against imperialism and colonialism, but it's one where Native people of no matter what ancestry needed to educate and organize themselves in order to gain access to this potential and future. So some of the goals and struggles, originally it was imagined to be a PhD granting institution. All of this was shoved aside because of the initial struggles and impact and experience of trying to buck the system, right? So the Department of Education, religious groups, local white farmers in and around Davis, they were all anti-DQU. They really could not find any support, especially in a large public way, funding or otherwise. So this became a struggle uniquely of poor working class Chicanos and Indians. This was not a struggle entertained by a bunch of academics and lived out by a bunch of academics or scholars or theorists. This was done by normal everyday people. They sought professional degrees and technical training because it was imagined, right, that we not only need PhDs, but we also need regular farmers, technicians, and these kinds of folks. So a people's university, right, was what was imagined. He also imagined, like Du Bois and other folks, that Native people and Chicanos needed to develop a group that was sustained and would sustain the community with their knowledge. And so the development of a Native intelligentsia or a Chicano intelligentsia, a group of people, scholars, warrior scholars, that would use their knowledge to empower and help the community, right? So oftentimes what happens, and he complained of this often, is that the university system and other education systems siphon the best of us off, and we never return to our communities because that's how labor market capitalism, global colonialism works, right? We've gained skills and abilities to leave, not to stay. So these were some of the issues that he wanted to deal with, because he felt that Native people and Chicanos were enveloped rather than being developed, and that we were undergoing a process of proletarianization or becoming workers within a global colonial system, as opposed to becoming free peoples, right? So land of the free. Skip some of these. These are all founders, people who helped found, but you get an idea from the kind of stance and approach from some of these murals. This was found just on a wall casually in a classroom of the approach that DQU took as opposed to many other tribal colleges and universities. It took a very anti-colonial approach. And so Forbes points out that DQU was viewed as kind of a lightning rod because it stuck out so much. Not only was it pro-indigenous, pro-Chicano, but it was anti-colonial, anti-imperial, anti-white supremacist. These were aspects of it that other colleges and universities don't avowedly take. And DQ did take that approach, and therefore it was targeted like lightning targets the tallest tree. And it was targeted on a number of levels. Department of Education blackballed them from getting funds. FBI investigated them nearly every day for their entire existence. All of the founders were watched, all of the founders were surveilled, all of the students and their organizations were infiltrated for 30, 40 years consistently. They had to sue the federal government multiple times for libel and for slander and for taking away their funding and these kinds of things. They won by the 1980s, but they had been destroyed like many other organizations through the legal process and extra legal process through their engagement with power and control. So there are so many things to mention about DQ. Its past, its history, experience. Here are some examples of where it fits in the sake. Even in this map, DQ doesn't exist in the map because by 2005, it wasn't an accredited institution anymore. It still exists on paper. It still exists on the land itself. I've been a part of the education committee for many years, and we've gone nowhere. We've been able to try to bring it back, but the school is in debt. The school is struggling. The school has not been able to regain accreditation. And part of this is because of its stance and its approach to education, right? It would have been surviving today, flourishing today, but as a shell of its original conception. And it would have survived because it would have been allowed to, right? And it would have been allowed to if it was safe and not so dangerous, if it didn't excite and incite so many people. And I will just, I had other images to show, but these are not the message. Right, so DQU is the only Native college openly dedicated to Pan-Indian liberation. This was the message and the moral and ethical foundation from which DQ worked off of. It also worked off of that Native people and Chicano people were indigenous and therefore carried indigenous knowledge, traditions, community, culture, language, etc., into the future, while other people did not. And this is something that needed to be reserved and needed to be supported. But at the same time, how do you also educate people in a critical consciousness and an anti-colonial consciousness to where they will constantly work together and defend each other and support each other, faced against similar odds, similar enemies. And this is one of the issues, right, that most colleges and universities do not take, is they take an apolitical approach, whereas DQU did not. So you could see from its collection to other places and opportunities where Native people took action upon the land in order to take over various places. DQ fit right into the middle of this, and many people after Alcatraz occupiers were removed, they went to DQU. But they struggled at DQU because DQU was already founded, right? And it already had some foundation. So, but it provided a space though for those people to go to, which is something that many of them had not planned. Many of them had not planned for the after effect of what do we do if we don't win Alcatraz Island? And we don't get the university that we desired on Alcatraz Island. Well, Forbes is already working on that plan with other Chicanos and Indians to where there was a plan, there was a place to go to. And so many leaders from that movement and struggle ended up there, such as Dennis Banks, who ended up there in 1976 while running from Wounded Knee charges at the second Wounded Knee. Already explained that part. Yeah, so I'll end here. The founders concluded that most of all, the founding of DQ represents the throwing off of Anglo-American intellectual and cultural domination and the reassertion of the vitality and value of the Indian and Chicano heritages. So for him, this was the most important aspect of it in one respect, right? We have the cultural aspect, but then we also have the political aspect. So he says further, a resistant movement which lacks an intelligentsia or people who have information and can practice careful decision-making will usually degenerate into a mere rebellion or an uprising. He says, uprisings are ordinarily put down by the colonial power, and we need something that's going to be sustainable. We need something that's going to survive. And this was a place, right? A place liberated by Indian and Chicano people. And there aren't many places that we can talk about that were completely taken over by Indian and Chicano people together. Maybe one group, maybe a smaller group here and there, but this was a group that was occupied and legally fought for and won. So they had fee patent title, or simple fee title to the land of 648 acres. So a square mile of prime farmland that's worth millions of dollars today. People have been trying to hold on to the land, trying to hold on to the deed, trying to rebuild the institution, but they're up against an uphill battle, which is Western accreditation, which is having a history now, right? The United States and federal government, FBI, has this long history. They have a case against DQ. So if DQ ever does come back, which we're trying to bring back for many years, we still have to battle with the federal government. So I'll end here because I know I've gone over, and I will take some questions for you all while I throw up some of the classes that the school offered.
Thank you so much for your research. And it reminded me a lot of struggles throughout Latin America and indigenous communities too. In Oaxaca, for instance, they were trying to build a Universidad de Comunalidad in the Northern Sierra. And I don't know what the updates are, but from when I heard last time, it didn't go through because of the government. And so I'm actually, though, curious to think about, and I'm not sure if you have the answer to this because this is a kind of like specific question. And I'm just like imagining a possibility for indigenous peoples to kind of think of education and like build a curriculum, like informing each other, right? Maybe in spaces where there are symposiums or seminars, but like informing each other in terms of like what they're teaching and how they're teaching it. And I know that in Ecuador, they use like a lot of the key terms are like intercultural education. And I'm not sure if that's something that you have something to think about, but I'm just wondering if you've seen cases in which indigenous communities in Australia or Latin America, in Aymara territories or other Turtle Island places, in which they kind of inform each other's like curriculum and education. That's not necessarily that's affiliated more with like a native approach. And yeah, just curious.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the more recent connections. I guess a lot of my work focuses on kind of the influences as well. So Forbes and others drew heavily upon Latin America traditions and various struggles and movements. So they definitely didn't perceive that they did this alone or in a vacuum. And they definitely tried to influence other people as well. So DQ helped influence the other tribal colleges in the United States that were founded and was influenced by them as well. So they, together the first 6 formed the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, which exists today as kind of like the supportive body that supports tribal colleges and universities. But this was something that they tried to do, was make some of these connections. And it's perhaps, via some of these connections that there was some influence down south with like Ixil University or the Indigenous University of Venezuela. There are a number of other places because Forbes imagined a United Nations university, right? An intertribal university. And then the name DQ stands for the peacemaker from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Toltec leader Quetzalcoatl. right? So it's imagined as a combination and a unification project of northern and southern peoples, of the eagle and the condor, as that prophecy talks about. So if it was still existing in the way and shape that it existed in 1971 or 1975, there definitely would be collaboration today and conversation. But because other tribal colleges don't have this affinity and don't have this connection to indigenous peoples throughout the United States or the Americas, I don't believe that that connection is being made. And so we have groups like WINHEC, the World Indigenous Higher Education Consortium, which tries to make some of these connections and support indigenous higher education and K-12 struggles. So I think there are some influences and some connections, but this organization and unity, right, is still lacking, especially internationally across groups.
Thank you so much. I somehow see similarities of Pablo Freire and as far as they would be presenting Jack Forbes. By any chance, has he Jack Forbes, has he got the chance to collaborate or gone to Pablo Freire's writings of some sort?
Yeah, interesting question. I actually teach a Paulo Freire class right now. And so my students are hating on me because I'm here, not there. He was invited, Paulo Freire visited DQU a number of times, 75, 81, and in the 80s when he was, when he left the World Council of Churches and was traveling around. So yes, definitely there was some influence and some of the big ideas of Freire definitely resonated with people at DQU, but they were also weary of persons like Freire who didn't talk specifically about indigenous people, which suggests that he didn't have a consciousness that recognized indigenous people. Freire talks about peasants a lot, right? Freire talks about the oppressed. As a collective big group. He doesn't identify indigenous people, indigenous knowledge, indigenous power or languages necessarily all the time everywhere. So I think this was one of the problems for Native peoples here in Northern America, is they didn't feel recognized by Freire, and Freire didn't talk specific enough, right? So for example, Freire talks about class consciousness, whereas Forbes says we need to be aware of caste consciousness. We've been racialized into a colonial and racial caste system, whereas Freire doesn't talk about the racial and colonial caste system as such. He mentions it, but that's not his focus. It's not his emphasis. That's not the problem, right? And whereas Forbes says that's the problem. If we can get rid of imperialism and colonialism and those systems that have been developed, or if we can change them, then we're targeting the real issue. So I think there is connection and influence, but I think Native people take what they want because they have to find what's useful and jettison what's not useful. So I think there definitely is some influence here and there. And he did visit, so people invited him. You know, they wanted that influence.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, I appreciate it.